The gunshot echoed across the endless prairie like thunder trapped in amber, reverberating through the tall grass until it dissolved into the whisper of wind. Thomas McKenna's hands trembled as he knelt beside the still form of his sheepdog, Buck, the only soul who'd followed him into this God-forsaken wilderness without question, without judgment, without the weight of his past dragging behind like chains. Blood stained the golden fur. Dark and final under the merciless Dakota sun, Thomas's weathered face, scarred by battles he'd rather forget, crumpled as he pressed his forehead against his companion's flank. The silence that followed was different from the usual prairie quiet. It was the silence of loss, of loneliness so profound it seemed to swallow the very horizon. That's when he heard the sound that would change everything, a soft whimper, barely audible above the wind's mournful song. 20 yards away, half hidden in the shadow of a wind-twisted cottonwood, a figure struggled against rough hemp rope. Thomas rose slowly, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt .45 at his hip, a habit carved deep by 3 years of cavalry service that had ended in disgrace. But as his eyes adjusted to the dappled shade, the weapon remained holstered. She couldn't have been more than 20, her bronze skin glistening with perspiration and streaked with dust from the prairie floor. Dark hair, black as a moonless night, fell in waves around her shoulders, and her eyes, those eyes held a fire that spoke of dignity unbroken despite the bonds that held her. She wore traditional buckskin decorated with intricate beadwork, but it was torn and stained from her ordeal. "Easy there," Thomas murmured, approaching with the same gentle cadence he'd once used to calm spooked horses during cavalry raids. "I'm not going to hurt you." The young woman's gaze followed his every movement, suspicious but not afraid. As he knelt to examine the ropes, Thomas noticed something that made his blood run cold. They weren't just any ropes. These were military issue, the same kind he'd seen used in cavalry camps. Someone with army connections had done this. His knife made quick work of the bonds, and she rubbed her wrists where the rope had chafed the skin raw. When she spoke, her English was clear, though accented with the musical cadences of her native tongue. "Your dog," she said, looking past him to where Buck lay still. "They shot him when he tried to protect you from following. You saw who did this." Thomas felt anger kindle in his chest, not the wild, destructive rage that had gotten him court-martialed, but something colder, more focused. She nodded gravely. 3 men, 2 in blue coats, 1 in buckskin. They spoke of money, of delivering me to someone called Colonel Morrison. The name hit Thomas like a physical blow. Colonel Morrison, his former commanding officer, the man who'd orchestrated his disgraceful discharge when Thomas had refused to participate in what Morrison euphemistically called Indian pacification. The same man who now held significant influence in territorial politics and had his fingers in every profitable enterprise from cattle ranching to mining claims. "We need to get you out of here," Thomas said, rising and scanning the horizon. "They'll be back." "No." Her voice carried surprising firmness. "I cannot run anymore." For the first time, Thomas really looked at her, not as a victim to be rescued, but as a person with her own story, her own choices. "What's your name?" She hesitated, then lifted her chin with quiet pride. "I am Ayanna. It means eternal blossom in my people's tongue. But names—" She paused, studying his face. "Names carry weight, don't they? What shall I call you, soldier who is no longer a soldier?" "Thomas. Just Thomas." The admission felt like shedding armor he'd worn too long. "How did you know?" "The way you move, the way you scan the horizon, the guilt you carry like a stone in your chest." Her observation was matter of fact, without judgment. "I recognize it because I carry the same weight." They buried Buck together in silence, piling stones over the grave to keep the coyotes away. As they worked, Ayanna told him her story in fragments, each revelation painting a picture of a life torn between worlds. She was the daughter of Chief Walking Bear of the Lakota, promised in marriage to the son of Chief Iron Hawk as part of a peace treaty between their tribes. But the arrangement had been brokered by white government officials seeking to consolidate tribal lands, and she suspected Morrison's involvement in manipulating the agreement for his own purposes. "I do not love him," she said simply, placing the last stone on Buck's grave. "And he does not love me. We are symbols, nothing more. Pieces moved on a board in a game we do not fully understand." Thomas understood that feeling intimately. He'd been a piece on Morrison's board too, until he'd refused to be moved. "So you ran," he said. "I ran." She stood, brushing dust from her hands. "But running has consequences. My people think I have shamed them. Iron Hawk's people believe they have been insulted. And men like your Colonel Morrison see opportunity in chaos." They made camp in a sheltered coulee, as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. Thomas built a small fire while Ayanna gathered prairie sage and sweet grass, performing a quiet ceremony for Buck's spirit. The ritual was beautiful and foreign to Thomas, yet somehow familiar, a recognition of loss, a honoring of loyalty. As darkness gathered around their small circle of light, They shared hardtack and jerky from Thomas's pack. The conversation that emerged was unlike any he'd ever experienced. Raw, honest, without the careful politeness that usually governed interactions between their two worlds. "Why did you leave the army?" Ayanna asked, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. Thomas stared into the flames, seeing ghost images of burning villages and terrified families. "I was ordered to attack a Cheyenne camp, women and children mostly. They were flying a white flag, had already agreed to relocate peacefully." His voice grew quiet. "I refused the order. Morrison called it insubordination, said I'd gone soft, lost my nerve." "And had you lost my nerve?" Thomas considered the question. "Maybe. Or maybe I found something better than nerve. Maybe I found my conscience." Ayanna nodded slowly. "My people have a saying, the brave man is not he who does not feel afraid, but he who conquers that fear in service of what is right." "And what about you?" Thomas asked. "What made you brave enough to run?" A shadow crossed her features. "I went to the white school for 3 years. I learned to read, to write, to see the world through different eyes. When I returned to my people, I no longer fit completely in either world. The marriage arrangement felt like another kind of prison. Not because Iron Hawk is a bad man, but because it would mean becoming someone I am not." They talked deep into the night, sharing stories of displacement and belonging, of choices that carried consequences neither had fully understood at the time. Thomas found himself opening wounds he'd kept carefully sealed, while Ayanna spoke of dreams deferred and identities fractured. The dawn brought unwelcome visitors. Thomas woke to the sound of approaching horses, multiple riders moving with military precision across the prairie. He rolled from his blanket, hand on his weapon, and saw Ayanna already alert, her body tense with recognition. "My father," she whispered, pointing to the lead rider carrying a lance decorated with eagle feathers. "And Iron Hawk's warriors. 8 riders in total, 4 from each tribe, their paint and regalia making clear the formal nature of this delegation." But it was the 9th rider, hanging back slightly, that made Thomas's blood freeze. Colonel Morrison sat his horse with the same arrogant bearing that had once commanded Thomas's reluctant respect, his blue uniform immaculate despite the prairie dust. The party approached their camp with weapons visible but not raised, a clear statement of strength tempered by restraint. Chief Walking Bear, a man whose weathered face spoke of wisdom earned through hardship, dismounted first. His gaze moved between his daughter and Thomas with expressions that shifted like clouds across the sun. "Ayanna," he said, his voice carrying the weight of paternal love mixed with profound disappointment, "you have brought shame upon our people." Iron Hawk's son, a young warrior named Dakota with fierce eyes and proud bearing, stepped forward. "She was promised to me. The treaty depends upon this union." "Ah, the prodigal daughter returns." Morrison's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "And McKenna, I should have known you'd turn up in the middle of this mess. Once a troublemaker, always a troublemaker." Thomas stepped protectively closer to Ayanna, though she showed no sign of cowering. "She's free to make her own choices, Morrison." "Free," Morrison laughed, the sound harsh and metallic. "Freedom is a luxury neither of these people can afford, McKenna. This treaty prevents a war that would destroy both tribes. Miss Walking Bear here understands the necessity of sacrifice for the greater good, don't you, my dear?" The condescension in Morrison's tone made Thomas's jaw clench, but it was Ayanna's reaction that surprised him. Instead of anger or defiance, her expression grew thoughtful, almost serene. "I have learned something in my time away," she said, addressing her father but speaking loudly enough for all to hear. "I have learned that there are different kinds of courage, and different kinds of love." She walked toward her father, her movements graceful and deliberate. Thomas felt his heart hammering against his ribs, uncertain whether she was surrendering or planning something else entirely. "I ran because I was afraid," Ayanna continued, "but not afraid of marriage, or of duty, or even of losing myself. I was afraid of becoming a symbol instead of a person, of being remembered only as a treaty clause instead of as Ayanna, daughter of Walking Bear, woman who loved the wind and the tall grass and the songs of meadowlarks at dawn." She stopped directly in front of her father, close enough to touch, but held her ground with quiet dignity. "But this man," she gestured toward Thomas without turning, "he found me bound and did not take advantage. He buried his dog and shared his grief. He listened to my story without trying to change it or fix it or use it for his own purposes. For 3 days, he let me be myself, completely myself, for the first time in my life." Chief Walking Bear's eyes moved to Thomas, studying him with the intensity of a man who had learned to read truth in faces scarred by deception. "And what did you learn from this experience, daughter?" Ayanna's smile was radiant and heartbreaking at once. "I learned that love is not always between a man and a woman. Sometimes love is between 2 broken people who help each other remember who they are. Sometimes love is having the courage to let someone go so they can find their own path." She turned to Dakota, who had been listening with growing understanding. "You are a good man, and you will make someone very happy." But not me, and I will not make you happy either. We would spend our lives trying to become what others expect us to be. Dakota was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. The treaty will be honored, Ayanna said firmly, but in a different way. What happened next would be talked about around campfires for generations to come. Ayanna walked to her father and embraced him, not as a defiant daughter seeking forgiveness, but as an equal acknowledging mutual respect. I will return to our people, she said, but not as a bride. I will return as a bridge between worlds. I will use what I learned in the white school and what I learned in these 3 days of freedom to help our people navigate the changes coming to this land. Chief Walking Bear held his daughter at arm's length, studying her face. When he spoke, his voice carried pride that had been absent before. You have grown wise, daughter, but how will this preserve the peace between our peoples? Thomas found himself stepping forward, though he hadn't consciously decided to speak. What if the treaty focused on cooperation instead of marriage? Trade agreements, shared hunting grounds, mutual defense pacts, bonds that serve both peoples instead of sacrificing individuals. Morrison's laugh was sharp with derision. And who exactly are you to negotiate treaties, McKenna? A disgraced ex-soldier with delusions of diplomacy. But it was Dakota who responded, his voice carrying new authority. He is a man who spoke truth when lies would have been easier. He is a man who protected what he did not own and freed what he could have kept. The young warrior looked directly at Morrison. That is more honor than some who wear fancy uniforms. The colonel's face darkened, but before he could respond, Chief Walking Bear raised his hand for silence. There is wisdom in these words, the chief said slowly. Perhaps the time has come to think beyond the old ways of binding our peoples together. Over the course of the next hour, as the sun climbed higher into the vast Dakota sky, something unprecedented unfolded. Instead of a retrieval mission or a forced marriage, the gathering became an impromptu negotiation session. Ayanna, her father Dakota, and even some of Morrison's men, who had grown uncomfortable with their colonel's heavy-handed approach, began crafting the framework for a new kind of treaty. Thomas found himself serving as an unlikely mediator, his military experience providing insight into the practical realities of implementation, while his recent disgrace gave him credibility with those who had suffered under Morrison's brand of justice. Morrison, increasingly isolated as even his own men began to question his methods, finally mounted his horse in disgust. This is preposterous. Washington will never approve such unconventional arrangements. Then perhaps, Chief Walking Bear said with quiet dignity, Washington will learn something about what truly keeps the peace. As the colonel rode away, his departure felt like the lifting of a storm cloud. The new treaty that emerged over the following weeks would indeed become unconventional. Instead of forced marriages and land concessions, it established trade partnerships, cultural exchange programs, and mutual defense agreements. Ayanna became the first official liaison between the tribes and the territorial government, her unique position as someone who understood both worlds, making her invaluable to the negotiation process. Thomas, meanwhile, found a new purpose as a mediator and guide, helping other displaced soldiers and civilians find their place in the changing West. The stigma of his court-martial became, paradoxically, a badge of honor among those who had learned to question authority. But perhaps the most beautiful part of the story was what didn't happen. Thomas and Ayanna did not fall in love, marry, and ride off into the sunset together. Their connection was deeper and more complex than romance. It was the recognition of two souls who had found themselves by helping each other remember who they were meant to be. They remained friends and occasional correspondents as their paths diverged and intertwined over the years. Ayanna's letters spoke of progress in tribal negotiations, of young Native women inspired to pursue education, of bridges built between worlds that had seemed irreconcilably different. Thomas wrote of former soldiers finding purpose in peaceful pursuits, of families reconciled across cultural divides, of healing happening in ways no one had expected. Years later, when both had gray in their hair and stories to tell their grandchildren, they would meet again at the dedication of a school built on the site where they had first shared a campfire. The school served children from multiple tribes as well as settler families, a living symbol of the cooperation they had helped nurture. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had fallen in love that night by the fire? Ayanna asked as they watched children of different backgrounds play together in the schoolyard. Thomas smiled, his weathered face creasing with genuine joy. I think we did fall in love, he said. Just not with each other. We fell in love with the possibility that people could choose their own paths, that courage could take many forms, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is setting someone free to become who they were meant to be. Ayanna nodded, understanding passing between them like light across water. In my language we have a word mitakuye oyasin. It means all my relations. It speaks to the truth that love is not limited to one person, or one way of being. Love is the connection that binds all life together. As the sun set over the prairie that had witnessed their first meeting, Thomas and Ayanna stood in comfortable silence. Two people who had discovered that love transcends romance, that courage comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most profound gift we can give another person is the space to discover themselves. The wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying with it the laughter of children and the promise of futures built on understanding rather than conquest. In that moment, both knew they had been part of something larger than themselves, a story of love that transformed not through possession, but through liberation. Love, they had learned, was not about completing each other, it was about helping each other become complete.